The moment the council doors opened, they were already laughing at me. I heard it before I even stepped through, that low, chittering sound the Vreth make when something strikes them as beneath notice. It is a sound like dry leaves being crushed underfoot, and it filled the entire Grand Conclave chamber the instant my name was announced. Commander Yale Oren, Delegate of Earth, Provisional Member, Sector 7 Outer Rim. The translator bead behind my left ear turned their sounds into something close enough to laughter that my stomach tightened on instinct. I did not stop walking. The Grand Conclave of the Galactic Council sat inside a hollowed asteroid roughly the size of our moon. From the outside, it looked like a scarred rock tumbling through deep space, unremarkable, forgettable. That was the point. 70 worlds had agreed, centuries ago, that the seat of galactic governance should not be a target, so they built it to look like nothing. But inside, it was everything. The walls of the chamber curved upward in a perfect dome of black stone threaded with veins of bioluminescent mineral that pulsed softly, casting the whole room in shifting light, pale blue, pale gold, pale green. The delegates from the 70-member world sat at a great circular table that had no head, no foot, no hierarchy of position. That was the official story anyway. The unofficial story was that the closer you sat to the central dais, the more your species mattered. And Earth's assigned seat was so far from the center that I had to squint to read the expressions on the faces of the senior delegates across from me. My chair was also, and I want to be precise here, roughly 30% smaller than every other chair in the room. It was not an accident. It was a statement. I sat down in it anyway. I set my case on the floor beside me, reached inside and pulled out a thermos. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and I waited. Elder Vrethka was the first to address me directly. The Vreth are ancient. Their written history stretches back 400,000 years, and they carry that age in their bodies like armor. Vrethka was the eldest of the eldest, a creature that looked like something between a mantis and a cathedral, all angles and height and compound eyes that caught light in 16 directions at once. Its voice, when translated, had the texture of stone grinding on stone. The human delegate, it said, and the words landed in the chamber with the kind of weight that usually precedes a verdict. We have read your species file, 92 pages. We have read the files of every admitted species. The average file length is 460 pages. Yours was the shortest we have ever processed for a provisional application. I took a slow sip of my coffee. We have been a space-capable civilization for less than 2 centuries, I said. We have not had time to write more. Vrethka made that leaf-crushing sound again. Several other delegates joined in. A delegate from the Kalahari, smooth, silver-skinned beings with voices like wind chimes, leaned toward its neighbor and said something I was not supposed to hear. My translator caught it anyway. A mayfly at the table of stars, it said. Perhaps it has come to entertain us. I looked at the Kalahari delegate. I smiled. It blinked all 4 of its pale eyes at once, uncertain what my smile meant. That uncertainty was useful. I filed it away. The session opened formally. The chair of the council, a massive quadrupedal being called a Thurin named Delegate Harrovel, called the first item of business. There were 47 items on the agenda. Earth was not on the agenda at all. I was here officially to observe, to learn the protocols, to prove over the coming months that humanity was civilized enough to merit speaking rights, and eventually, perhaps, a vote. That was their plan for me. I had a different plan. I sat in my small chair, drank my coffee, and I studied every delegate in that room. I had spent 14 months preparing for this assignment. I had read every declassified council record we had managed to obtain. I had studied the Vreth history, the Kalahari political alliances, the Thurin legal codes, the old wars and the new grievances and the long, slow grudges that alien civilizations carry for generations. I had read about the Keth, a species not present today, notably absent, and what I had read about them had made me send a very specific message to Earth Command 6 weeks before I boarded my transport. Nobody in this chamber knew about that message. Nobody in this chamber knew what was already moving through deep space. I finished my coffee, poured a second cup, and I listened to the most powerful beings in the known galaxy debate trade tariffs for 4 hours. And I smiled, because they thought they knew exactly what I was. They were so completely wrong. I have a habit that my mother called my worst quality and my first commanding officer called my greatest weapon. When people underestimate me, I let them. I do not correct the impression. I do not bristle or argue. I simply store the information this person has shown me their blind spot, and I move on. I had been doing it my whole career, first as a junior analyst, then as a crisis negotiator, then as the youngest admiral in Earth's outer fleet, a title I had quietly left off my council introduction. Because a provisional delegate from a mayfly civilization does not need an impressive title. A provisional delegate from a mayfly civilization needs to be underestimated for exactly as long as the situation requires. The first day ended. I returned to the Earth quarters, a modest suite near the outer ring of the asteroid, which the Council had assigned to us with what I suspected was deliberate symbolism. The walls were bare. The air recyclers hummed too loud. I sat at the narrow desk, opened my personal log, and began writing. Day 1, I wrote, "They laughed when I walked in. Good, let them laugh. When people are laughing, they are not watching your hands." I closed the log, set my alarm, and slept better than I had in weeks. Because the pieces were already in motion, and there was nothing left to do tonight except rest. Tomorrow the real session would begin. The Keth border crisis would come to the table, and that was when I would learn whether the Council was as wise as its 400,000-year history suggested it should be. I already suspected it was not. I was right. The Keth border crisis had been building for 11 months. 11 months of slow pressure, like water finding cracks in stone. The Keth are a species I had studied longer than any other in preparation for this post. They are compact, territorial, deeply proud, and they have a relationship with humiliation that most council species have never bothered to understand. To be publicly shamed in Keth culture is not merely an insult. It is an act of war, not a metaphorical war, a literal one. Their history is full of conflicts that began not over resources or territory, but over dignity. The Council knew this. They had a file on it. They had read it and then proceeded to do, over the past 11 months, nearly everything the file specifically recommended against. I sat in my small chair on the second morning and watched Delegate Harrowville open the Keth discussion with what I can only describe as confident blindness. It laid out the Council's current proposed solution in the flat, certain tone of someone who has never considered that they might be wrong. The Council would formally censure the Keth Military Command for unauthorized fleet movements in the contested border zone. The censure would be entered into the permanent galactic record. The Keth would be given 60 days to withdraw their vessels. Failure to comply would result in economic sanctions. I listened to this proposal and felt something cold settle in my chest. A formal censure, entered into the permanent galactic record, a public document that every civilization in the known galaxy would be able to access forever, nomming the Keth Command as violators of Council authority. To a species for whom public shame is a declaration of war, the Council had just proposed answering a crisis with the single action most likely to make it explode. When Delegate Harrowville finished, the chamber offered polite sounds of approval. Elder Vrethkon nodded its angular head. The Kalhari delegate chimed softly in agreement. I raised my hand. There is no formal hand-raising in Council protocol. Observers do not speak. I was not even supposed to be visible, technically, during a full session debate. But I raised my hand, and something about the gesture, the sheer unexpectedness of it perhaps, the fact that no one had ever seen it done here before, made Harrowville pause and turn its great head toward me. The human delegate, it said. And its tone was curious rather than angry, which I took as a small mercy. I apologize for the interruption, I said. I know observers do not have the floor. I will be brief. Vrethka made a sound. Let the mayfly speak, it said. Perhaps it will entertain us. There was that word again, entertain. I filed it. Thank you, I said, and I stood up from my small chair and walked 4 steps toward the central dais, which was close enough to be heard clearly and far enough to be technically respectful of the boundary. I would like to offer some context about the proposed censure from a human perspective. I then spent the next 3 minutes describing, in plain and simple language, every major conflict in human history that had begun not because 2 sides wanted war, but because one side had publicly humiliated the other and left them no dignified way to back down. I talked about the sequence of events that led to the First World War. I talked about the punishing terms that created the conditions for the Second. I talked about the Mars resource conflict of 2187, where a routine regulatory dispute became a 2-year standoff because Earth Command had issued a public rebuke of the Martian provisional government without giving them a private channel to respond first. I talked about what happens when a proud species is handed a censure and a 60-day countdown in front of the watching galaxy, with no exit that preserves their honor. I talked about it calmly, specifically, with dates. The chamber was very quiet by the time I finished. Harrowell looked at me for a long moment. Then it said, "You suggest the council should not censure the Keth." "I suggest the council should consider whether the goal is to be right, or to prevent the situation from becoming something much harder to manage," I said. "A private diplomatic channel, opened immediately, with a face-saving framework for Keth withdrawal, something that lets their command tell their own people they chose to pull back, rather than being forced, would be more likely to achieve what you actually want." The chamber murmured, not agreement, more like the sound of people who have been surprised and are not sure how to feel about it. Vrethka spoke. Its voice carried the patience of centuries and the temperature of deep space. "The human delegate has presented a perspective," it said. "It is noted. However, the human delegate is, with respect, a provisional observer from a civilization that has existed as a spacefaring species for less time than some of us have held our current council positions. The council will consider the established protocols." There it was, the politest possible way of saying, "Sit down, child. The adults will handle this." I nodded. I said, "Of course." I went back to my small chair. I sat down. I poured the last of my coffee. Harrowell called the vote. The censure proposal passed with 61 votes in favor, 9 abstentions, 0 votes against. My planet had no vote. That evening, I sent a message to Earth Command. I had prepared it in advance because I had read the Keth file, and I had sat in that chamber, and I had known, not suspected, known, how this vote would go. The message was 6 words long. "Activate the contingency file," I wrote, all 3 tiers. Then I sat back and looked at the asteroid's bare metal ceiling for a while, thinking about what the next 72 hours would look like. On the 3rd day, nothing happened. The council met. It debated. It processed 17 other agenda items with great efficiency. Delegates exchanged pleasantries. Someone brought a dish from their homeworld to the shared meal in the outer ring corridor, and I tried a small piece of something orange and crystalline that tasted like very cold pears. I complimented the delegate who brought it, a young Kelhari named Delegate Silanara, who seemed startled that I spoke to it at all. We talked for a few minutes. I asked about Kelhari music. It asked with visible hesitation whether humans really use something called negotiation to end conflicts. I said yes. It said, "Our records suggest your species also uses quite a lot of the other method." I laughed. It chimed uncertainly. I said, "We prefer negotiation. We just got very good at the other method so that negotiation would be taken seriously." Silanara thought about that for a moment. Then it said, "That is either very wise or very frightening." I said, "Most good strategies are both." I went back to my quarters and reread the Keth strategic file for the 4th time. Then I checked my messages from Earth Command. There was one. It said, "Assets in position, awaiting your signal." I did not signal yet. On the fourth day, the Keth destroyer fired on a Council diplomatic transport near the border zone. No one was seriously hurt. The transport's shields held, but the shot had been fired and it had been recorded, and now the Council chamber was not debating trade tariffs. Now it was in full emergency session, and the sound that filled the dome was not laughter. It was something much more interesting. It was panic. Haravel was on its feet. Vrethka was using 7 of its 12 limbs in gestures that my research told me indicated extreme agitation in Elder Vreth. The Kalhari delegates were chiming in discordant overlapping tones that gave even my translator trouble. Species that had sat in comfortable certainty for decades were suddenly discovering that certainty has a shelf life. I sat in my small chair, hands folded, thermos empty, and I watched them. Then I picked up my communicator and sent 2 words to Earth Command. Send them. The first thing the Council noticed was the readings on the long-range sensor display, a secondary screen near the outer wall that most delegates never bothered to watch during full session. It was Delegate Silinara who saw it first, perhaps because it was sitting near the edge of the chamber, perhaps because it had been paying attention to more things than the others lately. It made a sound, a single clear chime, almost a question, and looked at me. I did not look back. I was watching Haravel. The alert came through 17 seconds later. The Council's own navigation systems flagged 17 vessels entering the outer approach corridor of the asteroid. All 17 were broadcasting standard identification codes. All 17 were registered to Earth. The chamber stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The way a clock stops when the spring breaks. 17 alien civilizations had been arguing over each other at full volume one moment, and the next there was total silence because nothing in Council protocol accounted for this. Provisional members did not have military assets. Provisional members did not have fleets. Provisional members observed and waited and learned and asked politely for things that were usually denied. Provisional members did not send 17 ships to the doorstep of the Grand Conclave without warning. Haravel turned toward me. The movement was slow and deliberate. Delegate Oren, it said, explain these vessels. I stood up. I did not walk to the center this time. I spoke from where I was. Those are Earth vessels, Delegate Haravel. They arrived in response to a crisis affecting Council security, specifically the unprovoked firing on a diplomatic transport. They were not authorized, Haravel said. No external fleet is permitted in approach corridor without Council approval. You are correct, I said. We will need to discuss that in the follow-up session, but they are already here, so perhaps we can focus on what they can offer first. Vrethka rose to its full height, which was considerable. This is a provocation, it said. Its bioluminescent markings, which I had learned to read over the past 4 days, were cycling rapidly through orange and deep red. Not anger, fear presenting as anger. The human delegate has brought a military force to a diplomatic station. I have brought a response force to an active crisis, I said, and my voice was level and unhurried. They are not here to threaten the Council. They are here because a Council transport was fired upon, because the Keth have not received a dignified exit from a situation that the Council's response made worse, and because someone needed to do something other than vote. The room erupted. I let it erupt. I stood where I was and I let them shout and chime and grind and click in every language that my translator could process. And I waited, the way you wait for a storm to spend itself, because storms always do. When the volume dropped enough to speak into, I spoke. 17 vessels, I said, and I put each word down carefully, like someone placing stones across a river. I will tell you exactly what each of them is. 8 are rapid response transports carrying personnel trained specifically in conflict de-escalation and emergency humanitarian response. 3 are field hospitals, fully operational, capable of receiving casualties from either side of the border in under 4 hours. 2 are electronic intelligence platforms. One carries a diplomatic team that has spent the last 6 weeks building a communications framework, specifically designed for the Keth Command's internal communication protocols. One is a long-range supply vessel, and the last one, I paused, just a beat, just long enough to let the room get very still, is what we call a negotiation asset. What does that mean? Delegate Silenara said, quietly, from its seat near the edge. It was the first time it had spoken in open session. It means, I said, that it carries something the Keth want more than they want this fight. We identified what that was 6 weeks ago, when I read the Keth file for the first time. It took our analysts 11 days to confirm it. It took our diplomatic corps 4 more weeks to build the offer into a package the Keth Command could accept without losing face in front of their own people. The silence in that chamber was extraordinary. It was a silence with texture and weight. I could feel it pressing. You knew, Vrethka said slowly, its markings had gone still, a deep cold blue. Before you arrived here, before the session, before the vote, you knew the censure would fail. I believed it would, I said. I hoped I was wrong. I raised my hand and tried to say so, but I had also been doing other work, because that is what humans do. We plan for the version of events where nobody listens. Harrowell's great head swung from me to the sensor display and back again. You had no authority to position assets in this corridor. No, I agreed. I did not. I am prepared to accept whatever formal reprimand the Council decides is appropriate for that, after the crisis is resolved. Another silence. This one had a different quality. Something was shifting in the room, the way temperature shifts when a door opens somewhere far away. And if the Keth do not accept your offer, Harrowell asked. Then we are exactly where we were before I sent those ships, I said. Nothing is worse. Nothing is lost. But I think they will accept it because we designed it carefully, and because the Keth have been looking for an exit since the day the censure was announced. They fired on that transport not because they wanted war. They fired on it because they needed someone to believe they were serious. We believe them. Now we are offering them something they can say yes to. I sat down. Delegate Silenara was watching me with all 4 of its pale eyes. It did not look uncertain this time. It looked like someone reassessing a calculation it thought it had already finished. The next 6 hours were the longest of my life, and also in a way the most beautiful. Earth's negotiation team, working through their custom-built Keth communications framework, opened a private channel with the Keth Command. No council observers, no permanent record, no audience, just 2 parties, a translator, and a conversation about what it would take to step back from an edge. I cannot tell you everything that was said. The terms of that channel were sealed at the Keth Command's request, and I agreed to that condition before the conversation started, because when someone is looking for an exit, you do not put cameras on the door. What I can tell you is that after 5 hours and 40 minutes, the Keth destroyer in the border zone powered down its primary weapons. That after 6 hours, it began a slow withdrawal toward Keth space. And that the Council's sensor display, which had been showing the vessel in hard red on its threat tracking system, flickered, shifted, and went dark green. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that reading came through. Then Harrowell said, "Delegate Oren." "Yes," I said. "The crisis appears to be resolving." "It does," I said. "Explain to me," it said, and for the first time the tone it used was not the tone of someone addressing an observer or a provisional member or a mayfly at the table of stars. It was the tone of someone talking to a peer. "Explain to me how you identified the offer, what the Keth wanted, how you built the framework." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about all the things I could say, the strategic language, the intelligence analysis, the diplomatic architecture. And then I set all of that aside because there was a simpler answer, and the simpler answer was also the true one. "I read their history," I said. "Not the summary, the full text, all of it. The parts about what they lost and when they lost it and who was watching when it happened. And then I read between the lines because the space between the words is where the real information lives. Once you know what someone is actually afraid of, you stop trying to threaten them with it. You offer to make it safe instead." Another long silence. "We have had the Keth file for 200 years, Harrowell said. "I know," I said. That was all I said. I did not add anything. Sometimes the most complete statement is the one that stops exactly there. That night, Elder Vrethka sent a message to my quarters. 3 lines. It said, "The human delegate is requested to attend a private meeting tomorrow morning at the 7th hour. The Elder Vrethka will be present. The meeting is informal and will not appear in the session records." I read it twice. Then I sent back a single line, "I will be there, and I will bring coffee." I slept well again. Outside the asteroid, 17 Earth vessels held their positions in the approach corridor, patient and quiet, waiting to be told what came next. Somewhere in the border zone, a Keth destroyer was heading home. And inside the Grand Conclave, something was changing, slowly, the way the first light changes at the edge of a very long night. The 7th hour on the Council asteroid is a strange time. Most of the station is still quiet. The environmental systems have cycled to morning settings, bringing up the light levels gradually. The way the asteroid's designers apparently decided was most comfortable for the widest range of species biology. The result is a slow golden brightening that starts in the outer corridors and works inward, reaching the main chamber last. It is one of the most thoughtful things I have seen the Council do, and I mean that without sarcasm. Vrethka was already in the meeting room when I arrived. The room itself was small by Council standards, round, low-ceilinged, furnished with a single curved bench and a plain table. No recording systems. No translator relays beyond our personal earpieces. No observers. The Elder Vreth sat on its side of the bench with the particular stillness that very old creatures have, the kind that is not inactivity but deep patience, as if waiting is not difficult because they have been doing it for so long it has simply become their natural state. I sat across from it. I placed the thermos on the table between us. Vrethka looked at the thermos. "That is the substance you consume continuously," it said. "Coffee," I said. "It is made from a plant. We roast the seeds, grind them, run hot water through them. The result is a drink that makes humans more alert. Your species requires chemical assistance to be alert. Most of us do better with it," I said. "We are not naturally morning creatures." The Elder's markings shifted, a slow pulse of pale amber, which I had learned over 4 days means something approximating amusement. A careful, reluctant amusement, but genuine. "I have read your species file again," it said. "Last night. The full 92 pages. And then some additional materials that our records division located from your planetary information network. You have a great deal of music, Delegate Oren." I smiled. "We do. And art, and a category of cultural output your people call." It paused, consulting something in its memory, fiction. Stories that are not true, created and shared widely for purposes of enjoyment. "And understanding," I said. "Fiction is how we practice being other people, how we rehearse situations we have not been in yet, how we learn to feel things we have not felt. We have been doing it for as long as we have had language." Vrethka was quiet for a moment. "The Vreth do not have fiction," it said. "We have history, we have record. We have the preserved memories of our elders, which are transferred to younger Vreth at specific ceremonial intervals. But we do not create things that did not happen." "Do you ever wish you could?" I asked. The amber in its markings deepened. "Perhaps," it said, and then, with the air of someone setting aside a detour, it said, "I asked to meet because I have a question that I could not ask in session without creating a formal record that would then require responses from multiple parties, and I find myself wanting simply an honest answer." "I will give you one," I said. "How did your civilization develop this capacity?" it said. "The crisis response, the prepositioned assets, the intelligence analysis, the diplomatic framework you built in 6 weeks for a species whose language your people have only been studying for 11 years. We have had the Keth file for 2 centuries. We have been managing their crises for longer than your species has had written language. and a provisional observer from a civilization that has been in space for less than 200 years comes to her first council session and does in 6 days what we could not do in 11 months. I poured 2 cups of coffee. I pushed one toward Vrethka. It looked at it with what I chose to read as openness. "Try it if you like," I said. "It will not harm you. I checked your biological compatibility data before I packed it." The elder Vreth looked at me for a long time. Then it picked up the cup with 2 of its forward limbs and held it in a way that was technically not the way you hold a cup, but was functional nonetheless, and it took a small sip. Its markings went very still. Then they pulsed twice, rapidly, in a color I had not seen before, a deep, vivid teal. I did not know what that meant, and I filed it as something to research. "It is strange," Vrethka said. "Most people say that the first time," I said, "and then they want more." I wrapped both hands around my own cup and let the warmth settle into my palms before I answered its question, because it deserved a real answer, not a diplomatic one. This creature had been managing the affairs of the galaxy since before my planet had invented the wheel, and it was sitting across from me asking a genuine question, and the genuine answer was also the important one. "We did not have anyone to call," I said. "That is the whole of it, I think. When we were in crisis, and we were in crisis constantly for most of our history, there was no council to appeal to. There was no established protocol to follow. There was no file of recommended procedures. There was just us and the problem and the need to solve it before it killed everyone." I watched Vrethka process this. "Every capability you saw this week," I continued, "grew out of a situation where humans faced something terrible and had to handle it without help. Our medical ships exist because we learned, the hard way, across multiple conflicts and multiple epidemics, that you cannot stabilize a crisis if you are only thinking about the fighting and not about the people. Our electronic intelligence platforms exist because we learned that information is the difference between a conflict that ends in days and one that goes on for years. Our diplomatic framework for the Keth exists because one of our analysts, a woman named Dr. Caroline Webb at the University of Cape Town, spent 4 years studying Keth linguistics as a personal academic project. And when I needed someone who understood Keth communication patterns at a structural level, she was there. Because on Earth people study things for the love of understanding them, even when there is no obvious immediate use. Vrethka set down its cup. Its markings were steady now. Not any color I had seen before. Something in between, something layered. "You described your history in the session. The conflicts, the scale of them. Your species has caused great harm to itself." "Yes," I said, "we have." "And yet you speak of it without," it paused, searching for the word, "without the weight I would expect, without the damage of it." I thought about how to answer that. I thought about what the honest answer actually was, underneath the diplomatic one, underneath the easy one. "We carry the weight," I said. "Every person on Earth carries it in some way, through family memory, through history that we teach our children, through the places that still show what happened. We do not pretend it was not real, but we also," I stopped and started again. "There is a thing humans do, which I am not sure has a name in your language. When something is painful enough and old enough, we turn it into a story. And then we tell that story to each other, and we let the story carry some of the weight for us. And then the story teaches the next generation what the experience cost, without them having to live through it again. And from that teaching, sometimes, they build something that makes it less likely to happen again." Vrethka was very still. "We call it," I said, "learning." The word hung in the air between us. "The Vreth learn," it said carefully. "I know," I said. "All species learn. But I think there is a kind of learning that only happens when the cost of not learning is immediate and personal and very close. And for a very long time for humans, that cost was always close. We were never so secure that we could afford to be slow." Vrethka looked at me across the table. Its markings cycled through several colors and settled on something steady and pale, like deep water in morning light. Then it said, The Council will vote on Earth's full membership application. I will be supporting it. I held my cup for a moment. Thank you, I said. I have a further question, it said. Of course. The document you are going to present, it said. The Rapid Response Framework. The thing you will propose making Earth's forces the Council's crisis unit. I have already heard from 3 other delegates who received informal copies last night through back channels I will pretend not to know about. 2 of them are in favor. One has concerns about sovereignty implications that are not unreasonable. It paused. It is a sophisticated proposal for a provisional member who officially has no speaking rights. It is, I agreed. You drafted it before you arrived, Vrethka said. Not a question. I drafted the first version 8 months before I arrived, I said. I revised it 14 times. The version that went out last night is the 15th. The amber pulse again. Delegate Oren, it said. One more question, and I ask it genuinely, not as a political test. Go ahead, I said. Are you afraid of us? I looked at the most powerful delegate on the most powerful council in the known galaxy, and I gave it the only honest answer. No, I said. I came here to work with you. Fear would get in the way. Vrethka made a sound that my translator did not convert into any word I had, but its markings went to that deep teal again, and I decided, in the absence of data, to call it something like respect. We sat together for another half hour. Vrethka drank the rest of the coffee in its cup without comment. I did not comment either. Outside, through the small viewport in the corner of the room, the stars hung where they always hung, patient and permanent, indifferent to everything that happened beneath them. But not us, we were not indifferent. That, I thought, is perhaps the most human thing there is. The Council voted on a Tuesday by Earth reckoning. 64 votes in favor of full human membership, 9 abstentions, 3 votes against. I did not look at the 3. I already knew who they were. I had read their files. Their species had never faced a genuine existential moment. They had been comfortable for so long that they had confused comfort with wisdom, and that is a mistake that tends to correct itself eventually. It was not my job to correct it today. Harovel read the result into the permanent record. The delegation of Earth is hereby admitted as a full member of the Galactic Council, with all associated voting rights, responsibilities, and obligations. It paused, and then, in a departure from the standard phrasing that I was fairly certain it had decided to include on its own, it added, as of this date. As of this date. I sat in my small chair. They had not yet replaced it with a full-sized one. That would happen the following morning. And I felt something that was not pride, exactly, and not triumph. It was quieter than both of those things. It was the feeling of something that was always supposed to happen finally happening, like watching a shape you have been carrying in your mind for a long time step into the physical world and become real. I poured the last of my thermos. There was just enough for half a cup. I drank it. 3 days later, in the same small meeting room where I had sat with Vrethka, I stood in front of the full council and presented the Rapid Response Framework. I had not been given the formal floor. I was still technically learning protocol. Harovel had given me the room under the designation of a member briefing, which was a different thing, and had none of the procedural requirements of an official proposal. I chose to interpret that as welcome flexibility. I spoke for 40 minutes. I covered the structure of the framework, the command hierarchy, the cost-sharing model, the limitations of Earth's involvement, the situations that would and would not trigger a response, the reporting mechanisms, the exit conditions. I had brought visual models, which I displayed on the room's projection surface, because I have learned in my career that people understand structures much better when they can see the shape of them. When I finished, Harovel asked the first question. Under this framework, Earth personnel would be operating in systems where they have no historical presence and no territorial claim. What prevents the framework from becoming a mechanism for human expansion? It was the right question. I had been waiting for it. The framework includes a sunset clause, I said. Every engagement is time-limited. Earth forces deploy, operate, and withdraw. There is no provision for permanent station, no mechanism for resource extraction, no clause that grants Earth any administrative authority over the system in question. We go in, we do the work, we leave. If the Council wants to verify compliance, Earth agrees to full independent audit after each engagement. We drafted that clause specifically because we knew it would be asked about. Another delegate, one of the two who had been informally supportive, asked about training. Could Earth personnel train Council species in crisis response methodology? I said yes, with enthusiasm, and I watched several delegates sit slightly more upright at that answer. Delegate Silenara asked the last question. It had not spoken much during the formal sessions. When it raised its slender hand, a few of the older delegates turned toward it with expressions that, in human terms, I would call vaguely surprised. Delegate Oren, it said, you said in the first session that humans plan for the version of events where nobody listens. I have been thinking about that since you said it. Does your framework include a version for if the Council says no to this proposal? I looked at Silenara. I thought it was quite an extraordinary question for a junior Kalahari delegate to ask in a room full of ancients. I also thought that Silenara was probably going to be someone worth watching over the next several decades. Yes, I said, it does, but I am hoping we will not need it. The framework passed in preliminary form 6 days later. The final version would take another 8 months of negotiation, revision, and careful argument. There would be moments during those 8 months when I sat alone in my quarters at the end of a session and stared at the ceiling for a long time. There would be moments when I sent messages home that were, if I am honest, more tired than confident. There would be one particular afternoon, in the 4th month, when a 5-hour debate over a single clause in the exit conditions language left me so drained that I fell asleep at my desk with my coffee still in my hand. But it passed. And when it did, I stood in front of the Council and gave the address I had been writing and rewriting in my head since the day I stepped through those chamber doors into the sound of that chittering laughter. I want to tell you what I said because I think it matters. Not because it was eloquent, I am a better strategist than I am a speaker, and I know it, but because it was true, and truth is the only thing worth saying when you have finally been given the room. I told them about a woman named Nora Oren, my grandmother, who grew up in a city that had been reduced to rubble in a war she was too young to understand and too old to ignore, who spent the years of her childhood learning that the world was not safe, that the people in charge did not always make good decisions, that buildings you thought would stand forever could become piles of stone in an afternoon, who built a life anyway, who raised a family anyway, who planted a garden in soil that had been damaged by things I will not name here, because she said that if you wait for the soil to be perfect, nothing ever grows. I told them about my first crew, the 12 people who flew with me on the initial survey mission to the outer belt, none of them older than 30, all of them fully aware that the life support systems on that particular ship had been rated for 6 months, and we were planning a 9-month run. We went anyway. We made it back in 8. Marcus drove the return so fast that we arrived before our own resupply drone, which caused a minor administrative problem that I am still officially apologetic about. I told them about a boy named Danny who, when I was 11 years old and had broken my arm falling off a very stupid structure I had built in the garden, walked 3 kilometers to get help because I was too stubborn to cry and he was too loyal to leave. Danny is a structural engineer now. He designs the load-bearing frameworks for our deep space habitats. Every time I look at the specs for one of those habitats, I see his logic in the bone of it, the same careful thinking ahead he was already doing at age 11. I told them about Earth, not the Earth of history documents and planetary files, the Earth of early mornings and long arguments and meals that take too long because everyone wants to tell one more story, the Earth of people who fundamentally disagree with each other and manage to keep working anyway, not because they have solved their disagreements, but because the alternative is to stop, and stopping is not in our nature. I told them that humanity is not exceptional because we are strong. We have not always been strong. I told them that we are not exceptional because we are wise. We have made in our history some of the least wise decisions any species has ever made, and we have the records to prove it. We are exceptional, I said, because we kept going. I said it plainly, without performance. We kept going when we were afraid. We kept going when the situation was genuinely terrible. We kept going when we did not know if going would help. We kept going because there was someone next to us who needed us to, and that turned out to be enough. Every human alive, I said, is a descendant of someone who faced something that could have ended them and chose not to let it. That is not a boast. It is just the literal historical fact of our species. And it means that when we show up to a crisis, we are not showing up as people who have never been in one. We are showing up as people who remember in our bones what it cost the ones before us to get through. The chamber was quiet. I looked out at 70-member worlds sitting in that ancient circular room, and I thought about all of the history in that space, all of the meetings and votes and decisions that had shaped the galaxy I had grown up looking at through a telescope from my grandmother's garden. We would like to be part of that, I said. Not to fix you, not to lead you, not because we think we know better, although we will occasionally think we know better and we will probably say so because we cannot help it, but because the problems are real and the stakes are real and we have been building toward this table for a very long time and we are ready. I paused. We just need you to stop laughing long enough to let us in the door. The silence held for 3 full seconds, and then Delegate Silenara started it, that single clear chime like a bell struck once in a quiet room, and then another Kalhari joined. And then Harovel made a sound that I had not heard from a Thurin before, deep and resonant and slow, that my translator rendered as something between approval and wonder. And then the room was filling with the sounds of 64 worlds, each one different, each one unmistakably a kind of yes. Vreth-Ka did not make a sound. It looked at me across the chamber with its compound eyes, and its markings pulsed once slowly, in that deep teal that I had spent 8 months trying to identify in my research files without success. I finally found the reference 3 weeks later in a secondary Vreth cultural document that was not in any of the standard files. It was not a common color. It was something older than most of the words in the Vreth language. The closest translation the document offered was something like, "This is the moment I did not expect but should have seen coming." There is probably a human word for that feeling. We have a lot of words, but I think I like the Vreth color better. The next morning, they replaced my chair with a full-sized one. I brought a new thermos, double capacity. There was a lot of work left to do, and I was just getting started. I want to say one more thing, and then I am done. There will be people who read this account and think the point of it is that humans are better than other species, that we outsmarted the galaxy, that we walked into a room full of ancients and showed them what was what. I understand why the story can read that way, and I am not going to pretend the satisfaction was not real. It was real. I will not apologize for being human enough to feel it. But that is not the point. The point is that 64 civilizations voted to let us in. The point is that Delegate Silenara asked me a question that showed genuine curiosity. The point is that Vreth-Ka drank the coffee and then asked for the recipe. The point is that the rapid response framework has a full training annex, because what matters is not that Earth can do this alone, but that eventually more species can do it together. The galaxy is very large and very old and full of problems that no single civilization can solve by itself. That is not a weakness. It is a reason to build something better than what already exists. We have been doing that for a very long time. We are quite good at it by now. The stars outside my window have not changed. They were there before I was born and they will be there long after I am gone. But what we do underneath them, what we build in the space between them, that is ours to shape. Nora Oren planted her garden in damaged soil because she said that if you wait for perfect conditions, Nothing ever grows. I think she was right. We grew. Now we plant.